This is a very important session because we get to hear from a very extraordinary human being in the name of Justice Edwin Cameron, who is a judge at the Constitutional Court of South Africa. Many of you may have known of his long activism as a lawyer, fighting for HIV rights and gay rights. And proudly to say, most recently, we've got him into the TB rights movement, and so he's also getting his claws and hands in there to be able to ensure that judges in Africa don't forget about issues of TB and human rights. He has a very long and prolific CV, which I will not go into now, but I'll only say two quick things. If you haven't read his book, Justice: A Personal Journey, and I think you need to go to the bookshop. I think it's in Santon. Buy it so that you could be able to understand, as a lawyer who wants to move on issues of litigating on socioeconomic rights, what's the kind of pathway you need to do. And of course, when Judge Edwin retires, he may need more money in his pocket, so the more books you buy, the better for him, and ensuring that he lives a happy and graceful life. But I also want to say that his work has been noted by none other than Nelson Mandela, who has noted him as one of the South African heroes that needs a special mention. Of course, Justice Edwin, you have many fans in this room. Some profess to how they are your heroes. I will not name and I will not look at anyone for purposes of disclosing who they are, but you've got very many lawyers in the room who really are inspired by the work you've done as a lawyer, the work you've done as a judge, and the work that you continue to do as an activist for HIV, TB, and gay rights. So we are very privileged to have you here, to have the keynote. We've got lawyers from almost 10 or plus African countries who are eager to get some wisdom from you and some motivation. The last thing I wanted to say about Justice Edwin Cameron, ever since I've known him for the last 6 to 7 years, I have never seen him use a PowerPoint in my life. I don't know whether anyone has, and I don't think he'll be shocking us today, but he speaks from the heart, he speaks wisdom, and trust me, none of you will go to sleep. I can put money on that. So allow me to welcome Justice Edwin Cameron to give us the keynote address.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. That's pretty good. Largely African audience, but not loud enough. Good morning. How are you? I was pleased to attend that first session. It's most informative, and I'm very pleased to be with old comrades and colleagues, and also to meet new comrades and colleagues. I want to start by asking some of the questions that lay behind the opening session, the questions about the law. And you're visiting Johannesburg, where the court in which I sit is seated in Braamfontein, the Constitutional Court of South Africa. We are 11 judges, and we are the highest court on both constitutional matters and all matters of the law in South Africa. And in the last few weeks, you may be aware that our country has been gripped by a very intense leadership transition. And the leadership transition arose from a decision that the court in which I sit gave on the 31st of March 2016. And that decision concerned the expenses that the public purse paid on the private homestead of then President Jacob Zuma. And the court found that President Zuma had failed to fulfill his constitutional duty as president to uphold the Constitution when he refused to implement a decision regarding repayment of some of those expenses by the public protector, who at that point was Advocate Thuli Madonsela. Now, I tell you that because Johannesburg and South Africa are a good place to be considering what this seminar is about, which is the law. And to talk to South Africans, and black South Africans in particular, but also white South Africans, about the role is also very informative, the role of the law. Because under apartheid, the law in South Africa was used to entrench the privilege of people like me, white people, For 350 years, and especially the last 50 or 60 years of apartheid, when it became more viciously and rigidly institutionalized and enforced from 1948. For all those years, the law was used to subordinate the majority of South Africa's people. It was used for evil and pernicious purposes. And it was based, and this is also pertinent to what we're discussing. First point is, how do you use the law? The second point is, on what premise do you use the law? And the premise that the law was used to deprive the majority of South Africans, black South Africans, of their citizenship, of their freedom of movement, of their ability to seek jobs, of their ability to acquire skills and qualifications in order to get jobs, of who they could sleep with. All of these facets, the law regulated on the premise of inferiority. The shameful premise that a particular group of people, those who look like me, the melanin-deprived group, were superior to the other. I see the people who are laughing are somewhat melanin-deprived themselves. Colleen, if you go into the sun, I think you'll become less melanin-deprived. But it's true, ladies and gentlemen, it's a shameful fact, and it's important to our discussions in this room over the next 3 days, that the law was based on a premise of racial superiority, a false and shameful premise which no one in South Africa now would dare to defend. But for 350 years, the idea of segregation, the idea of deprivation of civic rights, the idea of separate residential areas, the idea of job reservation, the idea of the Immorality Act that prevented black people from having sex across the color line, all of that was based on a disgraceful and faulty social premise. Apartheid came to an end, formally, for various reasons. In 1990, President F.W. de Klerk announced the renunciation of formal apartheid and the start of negotiations, and 4 years later, we got our first constitution. And the constitution was determined to do the opposite of what apartheid had done. Instead of using the law to subject people to injustice, to subject people to degrading conditions that took away their dignity or attempted to take away their human dignity, the law put at the centerpiece the notion of human dignity. And our Bill of Rights says that everyone has the right to human dignity. Everyone has the right to equality. The first chapter of our Constitution contains the founding provisions, and human dignity and equality and the achievement of freedom are the centerpieces, the founding values of our Constitution. One of the founding values is the rule of law. Another founding value, which isn't expressly mentioned, but is mentioned in the beautiful preamble. There's a 200-word preamble to our Constitution that is worth Googling and reading, because it is 200 of the best chosen words that have ever come out of our country. At the core of the preamble of our Constitution, there's the word diversity. And diversity is something that every one of us as Africans knows almost too much about. We in South Africa prized whiteness. We prized male white people. They were the privileged, the super privileged. We did not respect the fact that people had different languages, they had different cultures, they had different racial characteristics and appearances. The law privileged some at the expense of the other, and the new Constitution turned its back on that. And it did so at a crucial time in our country, because at the very time that the Constitution took effect in 1994, in Burundi, about 3,500 kilometers to the north of where we're sitting now, the most horrific genocide was taking place. Is there anyone from Burundi here? Annabelle? No, not in the room right now. 10,000 people a day, every day, for 90 days. Nearly 900,000 people massacred in the Burundian genocide of 1994. And the point I'm making is that, again, it came upon a crucial supposition that diversity was not something to be prized and valued. In South Africa, we turned that on its head. And the reason we value diversity is twofold. It's manyfold, but two of the reasons are, firstly, that diversity encourages human flourishing, it encourages human activity, it encourages human inclusivity. But more important, the opposite of diversity, which is exclusion, which is persecution, which is ostracism and isolation, is a terrible cost to inflict upon any society, and we saw that in Burundi. So I say all of that, ladies and gentlemen, as a prelude to saying that you are in the right place to think about the questions that you are thinking about. The law is now at the center of our national narrative. All political parties, the governing party, the main opposition parties, the EFF and the DA, all the other opposition parties, they swear allegiance to the Constitution. They agree on the Constitution as the founding premise of all their political activity. And that is a consequence of our grief-stricken history of law. We didn't come to our Constitution where a president left office and a new president has just taken office last Friday. Amongst many people, I don't have any views on this because his predecessor is still a litigant in the court in which I sat, but amongst many people with great hope and jubilation. That was enabled by our commitment, not just as a political class or an elite in-group, but as a people, a widely spread, a widely disseminated sense of commitment to constitutionalism and the law. And that was attained at the cost of 350 years of misuse of the law. And now you can see why I've given you that introduction, because I want to talk about the misuse of the law. The law should be based on facts. The law should not be based on stereotypes. The law should not be based on misinformation. The law should not enact stigma. The law should not persecute people because of misinformation and stereotypes and stigma. And what we have with both TB, KELIN reassured me in one of the answers to the questions from the floor that I understand your question correctly, KELIN, that as at present there are no specific statutes criminalizing TB yet. And of course, ladies and gentlemen, as Alan said to you, I became a belated entrant to this vital debate about TB. And I became so willingly and humbly because the death toll from TB on our continent exceeds that of HIV, and because the difficulties that people with TB suffer, they also suffer the stigma that I'm going to speak about in a moment. But the treatment of TB, which was described when I participated in my first seminar on TB in Nairobi in June 2016, was described as ghastly by many people who've recovered from it. So there are specific differences between TB and HIV, and one of them, as I contended very carefully in Nairobi 20 months ago, was that the stigma that attaches to HIV is central and is overwhelming in a way that the stigma that also attaches to TB is not quite as intense and is not quite as debilitating. But nevertheless, despite those differences, the important fact is that TB and HIV are twinned in our continent. Archbishop Tutu called them dire partners in death, the twin ungodly killers, the very phrase that Archbishop Tutu used. I wanted to quote to you what Dr. Francois Venter said at that meeting. He's going to be speaking here. He's a wonderful clinician, by the way. He said that TB treatment is still too long, too toxic, and too costly. He said, in fact, TB treatment still comes from the medical Stone Age. In other words, it's 40,000 years too old. It hasn't been brought into the present. So there are specificities that are different. And we've grappled in South Africa about how to use the law, whether it should be a basis for seeking social justice and dignity and equality between all people as opposed to precluding diversity, as opposed to establishing superiority and privilege. And we've also grappled with this terrible question of HIV stigma. I believe that HIV has been the most stigmatized disease in human history. And the reason I say that is that HIV is stigmatized even though the reasons for fearing it are almost non-existent. It's very difficult to get HIV. By the late 1980s, there had been massive medical trials done at the San Francisco General Hospital where thousands of young men were dying of HIV and died in the hospital. And no single medical care worker in the San Francisco General Hospital, even though they'd been exposed profusely to infectious agent-bearing body fluids, blood and other body fluids, contracted HIV in those crucial first years of the epidemic. And this established scientifically and empirically with complete clarity that HIV was very difficult to transmit. You need an injection of sufficient active virus-bearing material. And the best way of acquiring that is through intercourse, whether vaginal intercourse or anal intercourse. It can also occur through inoculation through a syringe. But again, even with a syringe, you need the introjection of enough virus-bearing material for transmission to occur. That was established, ladies and gentlemen, 30 years ago. It's 2018. 30 years ago, in 1998, the first medical journal articles in the Journal of the American Medical Association, the New England Journal of Medicine, had already established this. And yet, 30 years, we are still grappling with this terrible question of stigma. And stigma casts a pall on all our efforts to combat HIV. And it is stigma that is behind the issue that we are focused on for the next 3 days at this workshop. It is stigma that explains the answer to the question that we got before tea time. Why is the law used at all? And we know that the law is used to target people in the way that it was used under apartheid. Malignly, not benignly. Misguidedly, rather than well-guidedly. That the law is used. It's used against women. It's used against sex workers. It's used against injecting drug users. And the questions that we must ask go to the very roots of what we understand about the law. What is the purpose of law in a society? The purpose of law is to establish values and norms by which we conduct ourselves. Values and norms which are aimed at protection of all at minimal cost to each individual. The law is fundamentally a mechanism that regulates the exercise of power, public power and corporate power and other forms of power. And the premise for that is human well-being. And it's in those few premises that I've just described that things go awry, that we go wrong, that we start targeting the vulnerable, we start targeting the isolated and the ostracized and the misunderstood. We start targeting those of whom we are ignorant and uninformed. The greatest outcome of stigma in our country was perhaps the biggest public policy mistake that ever occurred in relation to the HIV epidemic. There are two. The second one is the one that we're discussing now, which is the fact that across North America and in Africa especially, and in various other countries, there are criminal statutes that specifically mention HIV and target it for enforcement. That, I think, is the second major public policy mistake. The first major public policy mistake, and the biggest, was President Thabo Mbeki's denialism. He took office in 1999, and within 6 months it became evident that he had fallen prey to misguided notions about the etiology of AIDS. He had visited websites, he had received visitors who told him this is not a virus. It's not caused by sexual transmission. They're telling you it's caused by sexual transmission because we are black Africans. We are the only continent in Africa where there's a mass epidemic. They're telling you that we behave like gay men. And you all know how gay men behave. Well, right in there lies the clue to the stigma, because we don't understand AIDS stigma unless we understand the stigma of sexual transmission. I got HIV from another man. I'm a gay man. And gay people and men who have sex with men bear a double stigma of being a marginalized group because of their sexual orientation or the sexual acts that they choose to perform in private, and because of the HIV stigma. And the core of that stigma lies in sexual transmission. When I was diagnosed in 1986, more than 30 years ago, I thought that the shame I felt was because I was a gay man. I'd come out as a gay man. I was fighting for equality for LGBTI people in 1980s South Africa. I was fighting against apartheid, but also fighting for LGBTI equality. And I thought, here I am, a fighter for gay equality, and now I've become infected with this shameful virus. But I realized very soon when I started working with other people who had HIV that the shame wasn't about being gay. It wasn't about same-sex transmission. The shame was about sexual transmission, because women came to me, black women, heterosexual black women who were the partners and the wives of minors. I was working with the National Union of Mine Workers and with the Congress of South African Trade Unions to draft an AIDS charter. And my clients were women who were very different from myself in the apparent specificities of our human conditions, our race and our gender and our position in life. And yet we felt the same sense of shame at the sexual transmission. And it's the same sense of shame, ladies and gentlemen, that explains that the fact that we target HIV. You heard this morning from Edwin about the 2004 USAID-funded N'Djamena conference that gave rise to a rash of HIV laws. I must make sure that my own facts are correct. Edwin said 30, my information is 27, AIDS map says 25. Edwin, how many African countries is it? Where are you, Edwin?
I think it's 29, so we've rounded up to 30.
So he wasn't giving you the right facts, ladies and gentlemen. I think we should insist on higher standards here. Well, it's obviously, we'll fix AIDS map, and I thought it was 27, but I'm glad to know 29, Edwin. But ladies and gentlemen, the N'Djamena model law was based on a good premise that we should protect people with HIV. And then this model portion came in that added that those who expose others, not just transmit, but those who expose others to HIV, knowing that they have HIV, must be criminally prosecuted. And it was based on the biggest fallacy of all, which is that criminal laws protect people who do not have HIV. It is a complete fallacy, ladies and gentlemen. The one thing that we have learnt in engaging with public health over the last 35, 38 years, 37 years of the epidemic, is that public health requires us not to target people with HIV, not to punish them, not to ostracize, exclude, isolate, discriminate against them. And that is the terribly bad premise of the N'Djamena model law, which has proliferated across West, Central, and East Africa. It's even in Lesotho. It lies in the very belly of South Africa, where Lesotho is a landlocked country, where these laws have taken over. And the premise is misguided, ladies and gentlemen, because those laws simply accentuate the epidemic. They stigmatize people further. They lay them open to prosecution, and they doubly stigmatize people. We knew when the Zimbabwe criminal law was amended in 2004 on the basis of the N'Djamena law. It was Act 23 of 2004, Section 79 of the Zimbabwe Penal Code. We knew that the first person to be prosecuted would be a woman. And the most famous prosecution is, of course, Samukhelisiwe Mlilo, whose case went up to the Zimbabwe Constitutional Court 2 years ago in a very, very regrettable decision by my colleagues in the Zimbabwe Supreme Court that upheld the law. But I want to return to my theme because there will be many discussions, many practical discussions over the next 2 days. And I want to leave time for questions as well before we adjourn for lunch. I want to return to my theme, which is that we have to go back a few steps. We have to consider how we use the powers and the instruments and the mechanisms of the law. And when we consider that, the first premise that we should adopt is that our lawmaking and our policy making, like our policy making, must be based on facts. And to be based on facts, it cannot be based on misinformation, on stereotypes, and on stigma. The Constitutional Court, before I became a member of it, embraced that position in 2 rightly famous cases that concern people with AIDS. The first was the case of an air steward, like me, a gay man. He was called Mr. Hoffman. He had HIV, he applied for a position with our national carrier, the South African Airways, and they said, we can't take you because you might have to have a yellow fever injection. We don't know how people with HIV react to yellow fever injections. They gave all sorts of reasons for not being willing to employ people with HIV on the national carrier. And he fought the case. And he came to the Constitutional Court. Justice Sandile Ngobo gave a unanimous judgment for all 11 judges that said these reasons are rubbish. He didn't use the word rubbish, but that's what his judgment meant. And they ordered the national carrier to employ Mr. Hoffman with his HIV. But that was a prelude to an even bigger case, the case that confronted President Mbeki's stigmatizing notion of HIV. President Mbeki, the tragedy of his approach to HIV is that it was based on a monstrous misconception. Many of these laws, many of these misguided policies are based on monstrous misconceptions. He thought that the African epidemic of HIV was to do with blackness. The only mass epidemic, mass heterosexual epidemic of HIV in the world is on the only black continent in the world, Africa. Well, he wasn't specific enough. He didn't look at his epidemiology. He didn't look at the map. It's not an Africa-wide epidemic. The highest national prevalence anywhere in West Africa, if I'm still right, please correct me if I'm wrong, is under 4%. It's about 3.6 or 3.8%. Is that still correct, ladies and gentlemen? It's round about there. There's never been a mass outbreak of HIV anywhere than in Central and Southern Africa, the Bantu-speaking regions of Central and Southern Africa, from Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, Malawi, Zambia, Mozambique, South Africa down. I believe, and I think that research is increasingly showing this, that there is some environmental or, I believe even more strongly, genetic cofactor that explains the shape of the epidemic on our continent. But that's a question for science. What was not a question for public policy and the law was the fact that the virus is sexually transmitted in 95% plus of cases. And what is also not a fact is that sex is shameful. And yet this powerful inhibition amongst so many of us that we condemn people for being gay, we condemn people for having sex between the same sexes, men who have sex with men, women who have sex with women. We condemn people for having sex outside their committed partnerships. We condemn people for having many wives. Our former president, President Zuma, was subjected to much ridicule for having many wives. And I always used to ask people to go back a step and look at why they were scorning him for having many wives. Was it because they wanted to protect women, or because they were projecting some specious stereotype onto him and upon the African culture of polyandry or polygamy? So, ladies and gentlemen, President Mbeki got it terribly wrong, but he refused, because he refused to accept the scientific fact that HIV was caused by a virus. He refused to accept that antiretrovirals were the answer to the epidemic. Not the answer, but heaven knows, much of the answer, a huge part of the answer, an unavoidably massive part of the answer. And he refused to distribute them. He was taken to court by the Treatment Action Campaign, and they won. And that's also a lesson for us in this room today. The lesson from Mauritius, from South Africa, from elsewhere, from the states in the North America and the United States, which are busy changing their laws, is that our activism and our intervention and our propounding of rational discourse on HIV, rational discourse on TB, that can have an effect. It can intervene to change policies and laws and attitudes and judicial approaches for the better. The Treatment Action Campaign took up this case of antiretroviral treatment availability, and they won the case. The Constitutional Court, again before I was part of it, ruled in favor of the Treatment Action Campaign by 11 votes to none. And of course, I am here before you because of antiretroviral treatment. I was very sick with AIDS in 1997, and I started taking those drugs. Many of you will have family members or loved ones, parents or cousins or aunts or neighbors, brothers and sisters, children who are on antiretroviral therapy. And I knew within a very, very short time that my life had been given back to me. From being sick to the point of death, I knew that I'd been given life back. And that's why I couldn't keep quiet. That's why I had to start speaking in public against the stigma of HIV, for prevention, for treatment, for testing, and against stigma. And so we got through a court decision that was based on facts, that set out the facts, that examined the facts, that committed itself to facts, that didn't pass wrong judgment on sexual conduct, that didn't intrude the notion of misplaced moralism on sex workers or men who have sex with men or LGBTI people or people who've acquired HIV. That judgment was based on the facts regarding HIV, HIV transmission, virology, and how you fall sick from AIDS, and what antiretroviral treatment can do. And the court accepted the evidence that has brought me here today. The evidence that if you are on the right course of antiretrovirals, you lead a full and effective and vigorous life. I've been on antiretrovirals for 20 years and 3 months, ladies and gentlemen, November 1997 until February 2018, and I'm grateful every single day. But I want to make a few last points because I want to leave time for questions still. When we speak about President Mbeki, I love speaking to American audiences, even before the present presidency in the United States, because you find spectacular examples of American public policy making that is not based on facts. The Iraq War was a very, very good example of a catastrophic public policy intervention that was based on lies and deceit and false perceptions. And of course, I won't go into the present presidency over the last 14 months, which is perhaps even more catastrophically based on misconceptions and misperceptions and false facts. But the important thing is that misconceptions are not confined to this continent. The Canadian Supreme Court, in a decision that Richard Elliott, who's sitting at the back there, had an integral part in arguing. They placed the facts of HIV before the Canadian Supreme Court in the Maybior case. They argued that if someone is on successful antiretroviral therapy like I am, my viral load has not been medically detectable for almost 19 years. You can't have any instrument of medicine or science that can actually find the virus anywhere in my body. That such a person should not be under a duty to disclose their HIV status to a partner. the Canadian Supreme Court refused to accept that there was insufficient risk for the application of the test previously laid down in Korea. I've previously criticized that decision. I will do so on a scholarly occasion in the next month or two. I think it was a wrong, erroneous decision, but most importantly, I think it was a decision that shows the hallmarks of what all these laws show, which is stigma, the propulsion of improper, misbased information into lawmaking. The Maybe-or decision, I think, shows deplorable evidence of that. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me round up now. We have the capacity in this room, through your collective expertise, your professional expertise outside this room, your commitment as activists, but most important, your commitment to facts and to fact-based interventions in NGOs, in government entities and departments, in government decision-making, and most important of all, in lawmaking and judicial decision-making. We have power. We have seen the history of my own country, the history of many of your countries, shows the power of well-informed, well-directed interventions on public policy, with the enormous power of factual argument behind us. We face a great deal in the stigma and fear surrounding HIV. We have come a long way with treatment, but the stigma persists. The stigma is still silencing people. The stigma is still preventing people from accepting to be tested, accepting to go on to treatment, accepting to sustain their treatment. The stigma is still everywhere, but we have the means to fight it. We have the means to counter it in public policy making, and we have the means to understand it. And that is the way forward when we start to tackle these laws. Thank you very much.
I think you can do better than that, given that we're in Africa. So I will not bother to summarize what he said, but 3 things stood out for me: stereotypes, stigma, facts, and of course for lawyers, fact-based interventions. So with that, I can see the hands are already up. We'll take a round of 4 quick questions and see whether there's appetite for more. I see one hand at that second table. I see others are still dazzled by the speech. I told you he's good and he can capture your attention. I see a second hand. And those who are online, please type in your questions. We'll give you priority in asking those questions. So let's go with the first 2 hands that have gone, and I request for translation kit, because I know one of the speakers will speak in French for Justice Edwin. Just remind us your name, your country, and the question.
Thank you. I'm Sarai Chisala from Malawi. I'm a super fan. So if I sound a bit wobbly, it's because I'm over here fangirling. My question isn't a question so much as perhaps a bit of a comment. I loved every bit of that keynote address. And then you talked about facts and the power of facts. And I found recently that facts failed us in Malawi, in a sense. Facts aren't sexy. They aren't always convincing. Not everybody has time to listen to facts in this, well, I mean, they've extended the length of a tweet, but it's still a fast-paced, no time to listen society that we're living in. I did find that facts were powerful when told by people who owned that truth. And my mind has gone blank. It was amazing to hear you speak. Thank you.
Over to you.
Merci. Moi aussi,
Just 1 second.
Mais Moulahmed Doureidi du Maroc. Donc, moi, je suis aussi intéressé et aussi j'apprécie ce qu'a dit Monsieur le juge, surtout lorsqu'il a parlé de la loi cadre, les lois constitutionnelles cadres qui devront surtout avoir la possibilité la possibilité de cadrer toute déviation stéréotypique dans les lois, toute déviation qui peut donner stigma, ainsi de suite. Ma question, c'est aujourd'hui, au jour d'aujourd'hui, la pathologie a évolué, le VIH a évolué. Nous sommes maintenant, en tant qu'activistes de lutte contre le sida, nous attendons 2030 pour finir avec le VIH, la fin du VIH. Mais malheureusement, nous avons un grand obstacle qui est les lois qui tuent plus que le virus. Malheureusement, ces lois sont fondées en fonction des pays. Nous, dans la région nord-africaine, nous sommes des pays où nous avons des lois qui émanent en partie de la religion, qui refusent les droits individuels. Et lorsque on travaille sur le problème de la pénalisation du VIH, on arrive, moi personnellement, j'ai arrivé à faire sortir 3 personnes qui ont été les seuls cas qui existent au Maroc, qui ont été arrêtés pour transmission de VIH par voie sexuelle, lors des rapports sexuels entre 2 adultes, mais jusqu'à maintenant, les autres formes de la pénalisation du VIH, que ce soit les relations consenties entre adultes, que ce soit du même sexe ou de sexes différents, que ce soit la consommation de la drogue, c'est-à-dire l'usage de la drogue, que ce soit aussi les relations sexuelles homosexuelles, nous n'arrivons pas parce que nous sommes devant un obstacle qui est l'origine de ces lois, qui sont la religion, ainsi de suite. Et c'est pour cela que, à quel point vous allez nous dire et nous orienter pour que nous, activistes de VIH, on veut finir avec le VIH et nous avons des lois qui devront être abrogées. Donc, et pour les abroger, il faut une bataille, un combat, surtout, l'universalité des droits humains soit inclue dans les lois. Nous avons un gouvernement, nous avons fait beaucoup de pas au Maroc sur la modernité, mais avec ce qui s'appelle le printemps arabe, les islamistes ont arrivé. Et il nous faut reculer en matière de droits individuels et les mettre en avant. Nous avons même un ministre de droits humains qui est homophobe et polygame, et il le dit dans la télévision. Donc, vous voyez un peu, donc, c'est ça ma question. Ma question, quel est l'élan qu'il faut donner à l'universalité des droits humains lorsqu'on lutte, on ne reste pas dans le technique, il faut aller dans les fondements des lois. Merci.
So that was a great intervention from our colleague from Morocco, and because of time, I'm going to allow 3 more interventions so that we can be able to take them all, and then Justice would be able to do justice to them, and then we have a group photo and have lunch. And I do guarantee the big fan that you will be allowed to sit right next to Justice Edwin at the photo session. But for now, do you have any pressing questions? Our colleagues from the Francophone countries, colleagues from Anglophone, any questions? Was he that articulate? So we all know what we have to do going forward. And those who are online, any questions coming through? Okay, so we'll allow Judge to respond to this. Maybe it'll trigger something. I'm a bit shocked that there are no questions flying like they did for KELIN and Michaela. But go ahead, Judge.
Thank you very much, Alan. I want to thank both our brother from Morocco and our sister from Malawi for those questions. And the common premise of them is the hostile environment Our sister said facts failed us in the Malawian Senate. And you saying that you have a public political executive who utters homophobia and that this leads directly to homophobic laws and to homophobic practices against other groups as well, isolated and stigmatized groups like IDUs. And I want to start by just pausing and paying respect to that. That there are people in this room who are facing very, very hostile situations. There are LGBTI people in this room who face extreme danger on our continent and elsewhere because of hatred and because of ignorance. But I do want to say, that what you are doing is right, and what I want to say is that what you are doing is not without effect. May I ask you, sir, whether in Morocco 30 years ago, there was even a public debate about men who have sex with men or about LGBTI people? I think maybe there wasn't. I'm putting you on the spot.
Il y avait Hassan II.
That's what I thought.
Et lorsqu'on dit qu'il y avait Hassan II, il y avait toute torture et violation de droits humains.
Merci. But I certainly know from Malawi, which I've visited, and we have a strong and vocal group of Malawians in South Africa, many of whom identify as same-sex oriented or are men who have sex with men. It was never mentioned across most of Africa. There is this silence, and what you are doing, what each of you is doing, is to do two things: voice and visibility. Voice and visibility are the start of public debate. By saying what you are saying here today, by being beamed across many, many places, you are being a voice for rationality. I don't say it's easy. I have profound respect for those who work in very difficult circumstances. Certainly in both the LGBTI field and in the field of AIDS policy, visibility has been central. That's why we have recognized from the very start, Dr. Jonathan Mann, who was the first founder of an international agency for the WHO agency on AIDS in the late 1980s. He argued for the involvement of people living with HIV, by definition people who self-identify as living with HIV. One of the tragedies of the silencing of stigma is that we don't have more. We have people in our region who are openly living with HIV, but they're mostly working class people. They're mostly poor and dispossessed people. I say this and I don't say it for praise. I ask you not to respond with affirmation or praise. I'm still the only person holding public office in the whole of Africa who has spoken about my own HIV status. We know that we have tens, maybe 50 or 60 parliamentarians, premiers, cabinet ministers, prominent people, singers, soccer players, entertainers, soapy stars. We know that we've got them in our country, but the elite has chosen not to speak out, and I know why they have. I don't criticize them, because I had to fight to overcome the internal stigma, the internal fear of rejection, the internal rejection, which is the internalization of HIV stigma. But we know that visibility is important. With LGBTI people across Africa, what has changed the debate, what gives me hope, is that people are coming out and speaking out about being transgender, about being intersex, about being LGBTI. So it's simply a commitment in reverence and in respect to honor what you are doing and to say, please don't stop.
So there's a comment online. Let's take that one and then we wrap up the session.
We have a comment from Sheriff Mutuping who says, lawyers are human beings. Unfortunately, some of them are stuck in stereotypes and misinformation. How do we therefore engage them and hold them accountable to contribute to inclusive policies through the courts? Most lawyers are no different to religious leaders who lack information and they do not empathize with those who are marginalized and excluded by our policies.
Wow, and there is one more hand, Judge. Let me take that question. That's quite direct to us as lawyers. But there's a hand at the back. I believe he'll speak in French, so let's have our
Oui, tout à fait.
headsets on.
Charles Sommet de l'ONG plus Burkina, membre de Coalition Plus
Just one
Internationale.
second.
Ma question a trait, parce que nous savons que les questions de droits de l'homme sont universelles. Et nos États ratifient, signent les conventions, les traités. Et chaque année, on organise l'EPU, qui est l'examen périodique universel d'évaluation des États. Mais malheureusement, les organes de traité n'ont pas un dispositif contraignant amenant les États vraiment à respecter ce qu'ils ont signé ou ratifié. Voilà. Et en matière de lutte contre le VIH-Sida, on ne peut pas venir réellement à bout de l'épidémie à l'horizon 2030 dès que ces questions d'arsenal juridique ne sont pas réglées. La question des avocats, des magistrats, certes, il y a des homophobes parmi eux, mais quand on arrive à les sensibiliser, à déconstruire les représentations sur certaines populations clés, ils vous diront, moi personnellement, j'ai rien contre eux. Mais au niveau du dispositif juridique, il n'y a rien qui me permet, voilà, de les protéger. C'est ça le problème. Donc finalement, la question, quel mécanisme de pression, voilà, pour ces organes de traité, pour le respect des droits de l'homme.
Judge, I'm going to be very apologetic for this. I'm told we have one more, and that will be the last one. Then we'll have the responses, and Judge will give an amazing closing motivational.
We have a comment from Akinaldo who says, my comment is that people from Portuguese-speaking countries are left behind. I know that organizers made all the best efforts to bring them on board, but there are no applicants from these countries. I thought it might be a good incentive that participants spread the message to other parts of those countries. Judges, lawyers, and activists working with colleagues in Portuguese countries, please help spread the message and bring them along.
Well noted. Over to you, Justice Edwin.
May I start by agreeing with our first online comment about the stupidity, irrationality, and general reprehensibility of lawyers. And I speak for myself. We think we are clever, we think we are rational, because our craft is a craft of persuasion, and our craft is a craft of persuasion by best argument, and yet we fail in it ourselves. And I want to acknowledge that very clearly. I've told you how the Supreme Court of Canada, I believe in the Maybe-Or decision, failed that test of rational persuasion. It had all the facts and arguments before it. So I do agree with you. Then I want to make two final comments. The one is about this end of HIV, because both our French-speaking colleagues mentioned it, our brother from Morocco and my brother from the back of the room. I'm skeptical about this end of HIV because I fear that it's going to be with us for a very long time. It is possible. They found an effective vaccine for Ebola, which didn't seem possible. But we have been struggling. We have spoken about the end of HIV since the first press conference that the US Surgeon General gave in 1985. They said within 3 years we're going to have a vaccine. That was 33 years ago. So I'm skeptical about it. I think that there are no statistical models and effective human rights interventions that I think are going to make it possible to treat everyone right away. We are going to crawl towards a solution rather than running it. I don't close out hope. I have great faith in medical science and scientific research. It happened with Ebola, but I want to see it happening with HIV before I believe it. And if it doesn't happen in that way, we're going to have this epidemic with us for another 50, 60, 80 or longer years. So I think that should color our commitment, it should color our energies, it should color our strategies. The second thing I want to say is to my brother at the back of the room asks, how do we make human rights arguments translate? And of course, we do it as we do everything else, which is through alliances. We make alliances with trade union partners, with medical partners. We make alliances with arguments as well. The key insight of Dr. Jonathan Mann, whom I mentioned earlier, was that human rights and public health march step in step. They are partners and brothers and sisters. They are allies. They are not antagonists. Public health arguments establish that human rights approaches are the best. It's public health arguments that establish that it is wrong, it is counterproductive, it is stupid to persecute men who have sex with men, or men who identify as gay, or women or other people who identify as LGBTI. So we have to marshal our arguments in alliance with various other arguments. And then again, I go back to the visibility question. Often a single person who comes out in a leader's family, or a singer, or a soccer star, or a sports star, or a soapy entertainer, or a politician who comes out as LGBTI, or as having a family member who's LGBTI, can do an enormous amount. And then Alan promised you a rousing end. I can't promise you a rousing end, because I want to go back to what I said earlier, which is that if you look at the United States, which in June 2015 got a 5-4 decision in the Supreme Court that said that all adult consenting human beings are entitled to be married to the single other person whom they choose to marry to be. That was only 30 years after a terrible decision, also by 5 votes to 4 in the United States Supreme Court, called Bowers versus Hardwick from June 1986. So it was almost 30 years that it took from a homophobic, viciously expressed, biblically based decision in Bowers versus Hardwick to changing one more vote to getting marriage equality. It took 30 years in the United States. Even that 5th vote in the United States Supreme Court may be at risk if there are more appointments to the Supreme Court by the president incumbent. So what I want to say is I heard good news during the tea break. I heard good news that Michaela and her colleagues went to the African Union in Addis Ababa in December, and that the African Union endorsed a document that the African Commission on Peoples and Human Rights endorsed, which includes decriminalization of HIV, decriminalization of sex work, and equal rights for LGBT. That is now an official position of the African Union. Unimaginable before. I take the point that my brother made there, that our governments aren't sticking to these norms, but we have nevertheless made a genuine achievement by having these norms. We must invoke them. We must continue to invoke them vocally, unceasingly, and with continuing courage. Thank you.
I guess you're not as fired up. I thought you'd give him a standing ovation. Not even Sarai. Oh my God. I'm kidding. And I would really like to express our gratitude on behalf of the organizers for honoring our invite. And of course, we do take into account the advice and guidance and the journey you've walked us through from when the laws were being used to oppress people in South Africa to when they changed, and still facing the challenge of governments who are not receptive to ensuring that the laws are used in the right way. So I think with this wisdom that you've given us, it will help inform our deliberation, some of which is to help us get the facts right, get our strategies right, and eventually employ our legal mind to be able to ensure that we safeguard the rights of our key and affected populations and those who are living with HIV and those who are affected by TB. So on behalf of the organizers, we are truly grateful for having you here. Thank you. So with that, we release Judge Edwin, but I'm informed that before you have your lunch, we get the chance to have a photo with him, which will be at the lawn on your left. And we promise to give Sarai a standing space right next to Justice Edwin.